Welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today is another Q&A with some emotionally intelligent people. Again, our topic is creating psychological safety in teams. And in this second part, we ask the question, how do we create it? And our wonderful participants have watched the podcast, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life. But first, a quick summary before we go into our Q&A. So in part one of this series, we explored the nature and importance of psychological safety in teams. In the second podcast, we examined some of the ways this high trust environment can be created. In particular, how a virtuous oxytocin circle can be nurtured. So a pragmatic and even old-fashioned way this can be achieved is to support people in having many small wins at work. If people are supported in making daily progress on personally meaningful goals, their everyday happiness increases. So this is the result of great management that provides practical catalysts, things like adequate resources, achievable goals, timely feedback, and so on and so on. It's also provided, though, by providing psychological safety based on trust, respect, and explicit emotional support. When people realise that you genuinely desire and support them, they're much more likely to persevere until they succeed. Now, pushing people for high performance doesn't mean we lack compassion. Quite the opposite. If we want people to succeed, to achieve meaningful goals, we are embodying compassion, a genuine desire for people's happiness. Nonetheless, we live in very challenging times. Whether dealing with COVID-19 or concerns about climate change, the war in Ukraine, or global economic concerns, the combined impact of these is that people are re-evaluating things, their engagement, their motivation, and their purpose. So in the podcast, it was suggested that we approach this with cognitive empathy rather than simply empathizing emotionally. And we use this understanding of others to then embody the positive and practical state of compassion. This creates psychological safety even in these uncertain times. Suggestions to help people through these challenging times include prioritizing our own well-being so people resonate with our positive emotions, consciously adopting a stance of cognitive empathy so we can understand others' needs, approaching conflict as a collaborator, helping people sort out their difficulties, and always striving to give people what I call the three experiences, that they feel heard, understood, and accepted. All right, that's enough of that. I think let's move to our Q&A with our very emotionally intelligent people. And again, we've had one Q&A already on why psychological safety is important. But the focus here is how do we go about it, especially in the times that we live. Who would like to kick off this time?
I'll just kick off again. Why not?
Fantastic. Thanks, Terry.
So, how do you get someone who's very strong-minded, might have a bit of an ego, to have enlightened self-interest?
I'm going to make a few little leaps here. And if I'm leaping in the wrong direction, you better correct me, Terry.
I might not.
Yeah. So enlightened self-interest, in my understanding of that, is that the enlightened part is the realization that ultimately my self-interest is served when my success not only doesn't come at the expense of others, but my success is connected with the success of others. Is that the sort of thing that you meant?
I'd say that's half of it. I would say the other half of it is understanding that they're coming at it from a purely point of self-interest and that they're not aware of that. So how do we enlighten them to it so that they can then have a more comprehensive collective
Yes.
self-interest?
All right. This is you know, I don't know whether you realize this or intended it, but this points to one of the most difficult and most almost comprehensive, or one of the largest tensions in being a human being. And that is the tension between self-interest and altruism. And this is really, really deeply wired into us, that tension. Okay, so you can see that from an evolutionary point of view, a sort of Darwinian point of view, if we have no self-interest, we would not have survived as a species, as an individual. But also our survival is intimately tied into our ability to cooperate and collaborate, right? Especially in the ancestral environment with apex predators. As an individual, none of us would have survived. So there's always this sort of politics of being human, this tension between self-interest and a more altruistic, what the evolutionary psychologists call reciprocal altruism.
Yeah.
So that's hard enough, right? Getting that mix right. You then overlay onto it personality. And as you know, there's a range of personalities. People are not all the same, and they're substantially different. And one dimension in which is most relevant here is the dimension called agreeableness. So a person who's very high in agreeableness, they're going to naturally be interested in collaboration. They're going to be very sensitive to the success of others and the happiness of others. And they'll actually even tend to sacrifice some of their own needs in order to keep the social peace and to further the village's or the tribe's success. Down the other end, the low agreeableness, they're going to run the cost-benefit analysis very differently. Their social radar picks up a different social reality. It's not wrong necessarily, but they pick up is that life is a competitive domain and the job is to win. And, the village needs people like that as well. And so, but where we find conflict is where either side is too extreme. Where the person doesn't value their own needs enough to actually get them met, or where the person overvalues self and gets their needs met at the expense of others. All right, so now back to your question. How do you enlighten someone? I think that leaving aside people who are really psychologically damaged goods or who are very extreme from a personality disorder perspective, but just your average Joe, right? I think once people get a larger context, they understand, they have knowledge of the wisdom of cooperation, the wisdom of that win-win territory, the overlap between our needs, that I'm actually going to, I think there's a proverb somewhere that, it goes something like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to, it's something like, if you want to go far, go together.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So I think there's some wisdom there that we accrue, hopefully as we get older, that we realise our social nature and the fact that the deepest joys are in these social collaborations and social achievements. Because after all, we all just want to be appreciated. We want to feel like we're valuable. And I think that's one of our deepest needs. So, it's by perhaps some sort of education, like knowledge, it's via experience, but also by giving people experiences of that joy. And I think, for example, there's often an important transition for leaders. When a person moves from being a producer, as it were, to then also being responsible for other people's production. I often describe the joy that a manager will have at one of their report's successes as a sort of unalloyed joy. There's something pure about it. And for most people, when they experience that, they don't need any more convincing. They realise they've got a lot more leverage now, that they can be responsible for 10 people's success rather than multiplying their own. Right. So I think it's a complex thing. There's a number of things that feed into that, knowledge, experience, and some measure of wisdom. Okay. What else, guys?
What really struck me about all of this is just like how meaningful leadership how much influence leadership and setting that structure has on the outcomes, right? So both ways. Strong leadership can create an environment that allows for that psychological safety to thrive, but also either by deliberate action or negligence, the opposite can also occur.
Correct. So we have a tendency, in the modern West, to think of ourselves as individuals, separate, encased in our, in skin sort of thing, operating independently and autonomously. And this is a deep, deep mistake, a really deep misconception that, there is increasing evidence that the structure and even the evolution of our brain is built around our sociality, and that our identity is like entirely socially informed. Apart from our internal attributes, our personality, and so on. But we tend to think that, I'm just operating, other people are operating, and if I'm a leader and they're underperforming, that's their fault. Now, I'm not saying that a person's not responsible, but to not have an appreciation of the social environment that we create that's just ignorance. But Chris, I often say to people that the final frontier psychologically for people is an appreciation of how other people experience you. So we typically don't walk around with that awareness. Mm-hmm. No, we typically are thinking about ourselves, to be honest, or judging other people. But we often don't think about, well, how do other people experience me? And I think when we do, we're going to be less inclined for that sort of inadvertent creation of a space that inhibits people, mm-hmm. right? And more positively, we'll start to get actually curious and interested in how do I curate an environment where people thrive. And then it gets really interesting because you go, well, that's going to be different for this person to right. this person and to that person. And so gradually there's a kind of potential anyway, a fascination, an intellectual curiosity, and obviously a kind of even joyfulness at what can I be proud of that we can create together. And that's the essence of psychological safety, because that sense in which we're doing important things here. We're not just spending time, we're working on something that we think is worthwhile, and we're doing it together. And so then it becomes, for the leader, it's how do I liberate people? How do I take away their restrictions How do I help them overcome? How do I mentor them? Right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, any other conception of leadership than that is going to be a pretty poor one. It's going to be pretty unrealistic one.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
I think about it in the context of, the team of people that I have working with me, right? And how being really intentional about what that environment looks like. And as you say, I had what I
Yeah.
hadn't thought about, but like that catering it almost to the specific individuals as well, so that they're having a unique, although collective experience around that sets them up for success. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the way you do that, it's just so it doesn't sound too complex,
Yeah.
is if the overall environment is one where people listen deeply to each other, then when you listen deeply, you're going to tailor your response naturally to that person,
Mhm.
right? But in a general culture of deep listening like that, then shows up with different, accommodations made for different people. But the overall culture is the same.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Colleen, what's brewing there?
Well, the thought that came to mind throughout the entire podcast, and
Yes.
I had listened to it a few days ago and revisited it again today, was Jacinda Ardern's departing speech yesterday. And
The New Zealand Prime Minister, yes.
yes, and she asked, "Can a warrior be a leader?" And I think she represented empathy, and she represented everything that you could possibly want in a leader, because
Yes.
she took on everybody's worries and everything. And she thought, and she was supportive in so many things.
Yes, I think there'll be books written about Jacinda Ardern for very good reasons. But just a couple of thoughts there, because my sense of that speech and her as a person is that extraordinarily courageous woman, in that she had a lot of self-doubt, but she felt that the purposes that she was serving were more important than her self-doubt and her worry. And I think she surprised herself in becoming so prominent and so successful. But of course, what caused that was the kind of team environments that she created.
Yeah.
So she was literally elevated and supported by the people who absolutely trusted her, loved her, supported her, and needed her, And so she stood for me in many ways, unlike many politicians, of course. She stood for me as a representative of a really deep and universal humanity in all its vulnerability, in all its imperfection, all its self-doubt. And you feel the fear and you do it anyway because it's important. So that's just such a wonderful thing to bring up here, Colleen, because, she created a sense of psychological safety where a lot of things got done that haven't been done, that needed doing. She created a sense of pride, not only in New Zealand, I think, but pride for people who shared some of her more altruistic, values. And it gave people hope around the world that we can have some politics where people, as we say in Australia, are fair dinkum, like the no bullshit factor. Yeah. That he had the sense she was telling the truth, and how liberating that is for people to be able to tell the truth, especially in a post-truth age. Yeah,
and be heard. I mean, I
be
think
heard.
People really felt
it resonated deeply with people, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, guys, that's wonderful. Thanks very much again. As usual, you never disappoint. You always surprise. And I look forward to our next Q&A, whatever that is. Take care, guys.